But anyway, we have your questions to get to. We opened it up as always to the thread on forum.postwrestling.com and adding in your audio questions. So we have a pair of those to get to as well.
Why don't we start with an audio question?
Let's do
This one comes to us, of course, from memo.fm/postwrestling. And Luke Hale has a question to us. Let's hear from Luke Hale right now.
Hello guys, this is Lucael. Here's a question for Askaway. Do you think AEW should go back to having the ranking system? Do you find it was a positive that helped to give structure and keep the bookings stay consistent, or more like an obstacle that had to be worked around? Thanks for all the shows, guys.
Thank you, Luke Hale.
Lovely question.
Short, simple, good question.
Yeah.
I personally like the idea of a ranking system if it can be used to enhance your matchmaking. I think what it came to with AEW was it became something that was so much more scrutinized than it became a detriment rather than an asset. And I think that overly complicated things, because at the end of it, you want to be presenting the most advantageous matches that are going to have the most widespread appeal. And on a roster, yeah, there's weeks I'm curious to see Jeff Jarrett take on Rey Fenix. And it's almost as though they still try to keep this structure of, okay, why is this team or this person getting a title shot? And we'll put it under the guise of an open challenge. And therefore it just removes that scrutiny that they still feel they are held to of like, why would this person get a title shot? And it's pretty, like, it is not something that I think too many wrestling companies are held to, this standard of what generates a title match. Like we had, like last week on Raw, we have Natalya demanding a rematch for Becky's NXT title after losing clean to her. It's, again, like I don't scrutinize that stuff too much, but I think the rankings, it just put a spotlight on it, and it became just more harm than good.
I think it was not a nice idea and very ambitious of them to even attempt it, but I felt it became pretty clear on that it's not an appropriate method of storytelling for the type of professional wrestling product that I think AEW is creating. The more shows you have to do, the more roster members that have to be a part of this universe, and the more titles you have, I think the more complicated a ranking system becomes. It's just not a one size fits all type of model for something that is as vast and as varied as professional wrestling storytelling. And I think it just at this point more so handicaps and gives people the right to criticize when it doesn't work out. And ultimately, like it got to the point where they had to play too many mental gymnastics to justify why somebody was ranked number one, why somebody was ranked number two. And it got to the point where I also wondered how many people were even paying attention to the rankings anyway. They would update them weekly on the website, and I just don't think it's necessary. Again, if it was a promotion that was only doing one show a week with a limited roster that we're all having the same amount of matches, okay. Yeah, sure. Like in the G1, I think it makes perfect sense, to be able to do that. When you have a condensed amount of time for all these matches to take place, everybody having the same amount of matches, it makes perfect sense why win-loss records would matter so much there. But for something as varied as, a typical AEW year or season, I don't think it works. Even in the UFC, okay, let's take Real Sport, as an example. How often So the rankings are always going to be a subject of, controversy, I suppose. And at this point, how are they determined?
Through media voting.
And media votes how often?
I think they do them. I don't know if they're weekly or monthly. I don't know how often they do them, but the rankings there are, and it's a perfect example because I think a lot of the people that would criticize, oh, if this was a real sport in the rankings, I'm like, do you follow like a real sport? It's like the rankings are, it's constant that people will leapfrog others. Like UFC is a business of, we have to make a fight on this date, and if this guy isn't ready, the next guy is ready. And the latest one is Colby Covington is getting the next title fight against Leon Edwards, December 16th. Colby Covington has not fought since March of last year, a year and a half between fights, and he's 2-2 in his last 4 fights. And Bilal Muhammad is a guy that has not lost a fight in years. He's on this huge unbeaten streak. and he got leapfrogged for this title fight. And that happens routinely.
So why, in your opinion, does the UFC even entertain the idea of a ranking system?
I think that it does add like a structure, like it gives you a picture, but they are not beholden. Like this is your mandatory challenger, and this is our rigid process. We are ultimately in the business of making the fights that will attract the most amount of people. We are not a service that is just looking for who is the best fighter in the world. That's an overall objective you might have, but the ultimate goal is prize fighting and making money off your fights. And that sometimes will mean that the number 5 guy is a lot more appealing than the number 1 guy. And the more currency you have, a Conor McGregor could move up a weight class tomorrow and be gifted a title fight instantly. He is going to have more capital behind him than his ranking in a certain weight class. So that is always going to be like, that's where these industries are similar. You're trying to match make and create matches that are going to appeal to the widest variety of people.
Ultimately, I think the purpose of a ranking system, at least in this combat sport, in professional wrestling, even in the UFC, is just a way to basically give you a structure of who to know who the relevant players are, who the relevant characters are that we should be paying attention to. And they found other ways of doing that in AEW, and that's typically through either these tournaments or through these multi-man eliminator qualifiers, whatever you want to call them, or a battle royal. And yeah, we can maybe criticize how often they might rely on those sort of devices, but I personally tend to think that they're a bit more effective and a bit more immediate than, these sort of complicated ranking structures.
Wrestling should not be as hard because in MMA, in a perfect world, your most popular fighters would also be your most successful fighters, but you cannot control that. You would not book Colby Covington to be 2-2 in his last 4 fights going into a title fight. Whereas in professional wrestling, you can cater your booking to who you're pushing and control all of this. So, I mean, ultimately, you have that control that should make pro wrestling easier.
Thank you so much for the question, Luke Hale. Again, memo.fm/post wrestling is where you can leave your voicemail questions. We will be checking those throughout the month in preparation for the next Ask Away. All right, let's go to forum.postwrestling.com, where those of you can also leave written questions for Ask Away. And the first one comes to us from Roy from Rhode Island, who says, "Hi, guys. Paraphrasing a recent tweet from Suit Williams, who I believe was making this point from a purely creative perspective rather than through a business lens. What do you think of the argument that had Roman needed to or opted to step away from wrestling in either 2018 or 2020, that his run may have been the worst ever attempt by WWE at a face of a company in the modern era? People usually point to Diesel's world title run, which, bad as it was,